The morning of June 6, 1944, began like any other for Heinrich Severloh, a young German soldier stationed in a concrete bunker overlooking what the Allies would soon call Omaha Beach. At 21 years old, this farm boy from Lower Saxony had no idea that the next 9 hours would transform him into one of the most lethal individuals in the entire Second World War. As dawn broke over the Normandy coast, Severloh stood at his position in Widerstandsnest 62, a fortified resistance point perched on the bluffs above the beach, and watched as the largest amphibious invasion in human history began to unfold before his eyes. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life and create one of the most controversial legacies of D-Day. The transformation of Heinrich Severloh from an ordinary soldier into what some would call the Beast of Omaha began years before that fateful morning. Born in 1923 in the small village of Metzingen near Hanover, Severloh grew up in rural Germany during the tumultuous years between the world wars. His childhood was shaped by the economic hardships of the Weimar Republic and the rise of National Socialism. Like millions of young German men, he was conscribed into military service as Hitler's war machine expanded across Europe. By 1940, Severloh found himself in the Wehrmacht, assigned to various positions before eventually being stationed on the French coast as part of the Atlantic Wall defenses. His assignment to the 352nd Infantry Division placed him directly in the path of what would become the most significant military operation of the 20th century. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's grand defensive system stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, was supposed to be an impregnable fortress that would stop any Allied invasion at the water's edge. Along the Normandy coast, German engineers had constructed an elaborate network of bunkers, gun emplacements, obstacles, and mines designed to turn the beaches into killing zones. Widerstandsnest 62, Severloh's position, was one of the most strategically important strongpoints on what the Germans called the Calvados coast. Situated on a cliff overlooking the easy red sector of Omaha Beach, the position commanded a sweeping view of the entire landing area. The bunker complex contained multiple weapons positions, including heavy machine guns and artillery pieces, all carefully sited to create interlocking fields of fire that would rake the beach and the shallow waters approaching it. Severloh's primary weapon that morning was an MG-42 machine gun, perhaps the most fearsome infantry weapon of the Second World War. The MG-42 was a mechanical marvel that could fire up to 1,200 rounds per minute, earning it the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw among Allied troops who recognized its distinctive sound. The weapon was so fast that individual shots blended into a continuous roar, like tearing canvas. German doctrine emphasized the machine gun as the primary infantry weapon, with entire squads built around supporting and feeding the gun's voracious appetite for ammunition. In Severloh's hands, positioned on the high ground with clear lines of sight across the entire beach, the MG-42 became an instrument of unprecedented lethality. But Severloh wasn't alone in his position that morning. He served as the orderly and gunner for Lieutenant Bernhard Furking, the commander of Widerstandsnest 62. Furking was an experienced officer who had already survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, where he had witnessed the full horror of the war against the Soviet Union. The two men had developed a professional relationship based on mutual respect and the shared understanding that came from living in close proximity under constant threat. As dawn approached on June 6, Furking had positioned his small garrison of about 30 men as best he could, knowing that intelligence reports suggested something significant was coming. The question wasn't if the Allies would invade, but when and where. The first indication that D-Day had arrived came around dawn when Severloh and his comrades detected the massive Allied naval armada assembling offshore. Through the early morning mist, they could see hundreds of ships, more vessels than anyone in the bunker had ever witnessed in their lives. The sight must have been both awe-inspiring and terrifying. These German soldiers, many of them veterans of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front, understood immediately that they were facing an assault of unprecedented scale. As the naval bombardment began, shells from battleships, cruisers, and destroyers began pounding the German positions. The earth shook with each impact, and the air filled with the acrid smell of explosives and burning debris. Inside the concrete bunkers, the defenders could do nothing but hunker down and wait for the barrage to end, knowing that when it did, the real battle would begin. The Allied bombardment, despite its awesome display of firepower, failed to achieve its primary objective of neutralizing the German defenses. Many of the shells fell inland, beyond the coastal fortifications, or failed to penetrate the thick concrete walls of the bunkers. When the shelling lifted and Severloh emerged to take up his position behind the MG-42, he found that his bunker was still largely intact and his fields of fire remained unobstructed. As the first waves of American landing craft approached the beach, he could see them clearly through the smoke and morning haze. The soldiers of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions, many of them seasick and terrified, were heading directly toward his position, packed tightly in their Higgins boats with no room to maneuver or take cover. What happened next became a matter of historical record and personal torment. Severloh opened fire with the MG-42, and the weapon performed exactly as designed. From his elevated position, he had a god's eye view of the entire beach, and every burst from his machine gun found targets among the densely packed American troops. The first men off the landing craft were cut down almost immediately, falling into the shallow water or collapsing on the ramp. Those who made it into the water faced another nightmare, as the heavy equipment they carried dragged them down, and the continued fire from Severloh and other German positions churned the surf red with blood. The Americans had no cover, no concealment, and nowhere to go except forward into the teeth of the German defenses or backward into the drowning depths. As the morning progressed, the nightmare only intensified. Wave after wave of American troops landed on the beach, each group facing the same murderous fire that had decimated those before them. Severloh fired continuously, pausing only to change barrels on the overheating machine gun or to grab a rifle when ammunition for the MG-42 ran low. His position in the bunker provided near-perfect protection from return fire while allowing him to maintain a steady stream of bullets across the beach. Beside him, Lieutenant Firking directed fire and helped feed ammunition, while other members of the garrison operated additional weapons. The scene below was one of unimaginable carnage, with bodies piling up at the water's edge and the living desperately seeking any cover they could find behind beach obstacles, disabled vehicles, or the bodies of their fallen comrades. The Americans who survived those first terrible hours on Omaha Beach later described it as the closest thing to hell on earth. Companies that landed at full strength were reduced to handfuls of survivors within minutes. Officers and NCOs were targeted preferentially, leaving many units leaderless and disorganized. The carefully planned assault quickly devolved into chaos, with small groups of soldiers pinned down under intense fire, unable to advance and unwilling to retreat. Some men lay paralyzed with fear, unable to move despite the urgings of their comrades. Others performed acts of extraordinary courage, attempting to clear obstacles, rescue wounded buddies, or find ways to advance up the bluffs toward the German positions. Many of these brave men never made it more than a few yards before being cut down. Severloh later claimed that he personally fired over 12,000 rounds from the MG-42 that day, along with approximately 400 rounds from his rifle. If these numbers are accurate, and most historians believe they are at least approximately correct, the sheer volume of fire he directed at the American forces was staggering. Military analysts have attempted to calculate how many casualties Severloh might have caused, and while exact numbers are impossible to determine, estimates range from several hundred to over 2,000 killed and wounded. This would make him personally responsible for a significant percentage of the approximately 2,400 American casualties suffered on Omaha Beach that day. The scale of destruction wrought by a single soldier is almost incomprehensible and speaks to both the lethality of the weapons and positions the Germans had prepared and the vulnerability of the attacking forces. The situation on Omaha Beach was so desperate that senior Allied commanders seriously considered abandoning the assault and evacuating the survivors. General Omar Bradley, watching from the USS Augusta offshore, later wrote that he contemplated the worst American military disaster since Custer's last stand. Only the extraordinary courage and determination of small groups of American soldiers, who found ways to infiltrate the German defenses through draws and gullies, eventually began to turn the tide. Specially trained Army Rangers scaled the cliffs at Point du Hoc, and infantry units gradually worked their way up the bluffs through sheer determination and sacrifice. By late morning, some American forces had managed to get behind the German positions, threatening to cut them off and surround them. As American forces began to infiltrate inland, Severloh's position became increasingly precarious. The bunker that had provided such perfect protection and fields of fire now became a trap. with Americans advancing from multiple directions and naval gunfire being directed more accurately at the remaining strongpoints. Lieutenant Firking made the decision to abandon Widerstandsness 62. The defenders had held their position for over 9 hours, far longer than anyone had expected, and had inflicted catastrophic casualties on the attackers. But the battle was clearly lost. The sheer weight of American numbers, combined with their eventual success in getting off the beach and attacking the positions from behind, made continued resistance futile. The withdrawal from the bunker marked the end of Severloh's role in the Battle of Omaha Beach, but the beginning of a different kind of struggle that would follow him for the rest of his life. He and the other survivors of Widerstandsness 62 retreated inland, joining other German units that were falling back in the face of the massive Allied invasion. Severloh survived the remainder of the Normandy campaign and continued fighting until he was eventually captured later in the war. Like millions of other German soldiers, he spent time in a prisoner of war camp before finally being released to return home to Germany. He went back to his village, married, raised a family, and tried to resume a normal life as a farmer and factory worker in the new Federal Republic of Germany. But Heinrich Severloh could never truly escape June 6, 1944. The memories of that day haunted him constantly. Unlike many German veterans who repressed or denied their wartime experiences, Severloh remained deeply troubled by what he had done. He had nightmares about the faces of the American soldiers he had killed, young men not much different from himself who had died in the surf at Omaha Beach. The sheer scale of death he had caused, even though he had been following orders and defending his position as any soldier would, weighed heavily on his conscience. In the decades after the war, as D-Day became increasingly mythologized in popular culture and the sacrifices of the American forces on Omaha Beach were commemorated in films, books, and memorials, Severloh's guilt only intensified. For many years, Severloh kept his wartime experiences private, sharing them only with close family and a few trusted friends. But as he grew older and wrestled with his memories, he began to feel a need to tell his story, not as a form of justification or glorification, but as a way of coming to terms with his past and paying respect to the men he had killed. In the 1990s, he began speaking publicly about his experiences and eventually published his memoirs. His book, titled WN62, A German Soldier's Memories of the Defense of Omaha Beach, provided a rare and valuable perspective on D-Day from the German side. Unlike many German accounts that glossed over the realities of the fighting or tried to distance themselves from the Nazi cause, Severloh's memoir was remarkably honest about what had happened and his own role in the bloodshed. The publication of his story brought Severloh both criticism and understanding. Some accused him of seeking publicity or trying to glorify his actions. Veterans groups and families of D-Day casualties sometimes reacted with anger to the idea of the man who had killed so many Americans telling his story. But many others, including American veterans who had survived Omaha Beach, saw value in hearing from the other side. Several extraordinary meetings took place between Severloh and American D-Day survivors, encounters that demonstrated both the horror and the ultimate humanity of war. These meetings were often emotional and difficult, but they also provided a kind of closure that both sides desperately needed. One of the most significant of these encounters was with David Silva, an American veteran who had landed on Omaha Beach as a young soldier and had been wounded in the fighting. Silva had carried his own trauma from D-Day for decades, suffering from nightmares and survivor's guilt about the friends he had lost on the beach. When he learned about Severloh's story, Silva initially felt anger and hatred toward the German soldier who had caused so much death. But as he read Severloh's account and learned more about his genuine remorse and guilt, Silva began to see him not as a monster but as another human being who had been caught up in the terrible machinery of war. The two men eventually met in Normandy, returning together to the beach where they had been enemies over 50 years earlier. Their meeting was captured on film and remains a powerful testament to the possibility of reconciliation and forgiveness. Severloh participated in several D-Day commemorations in Normandy during his later years, always emphasizing that he had no pride in what he had done and that he deeply honored the courage of the American soldiers who had faced such terrible odds on the beach. He expressed admiration for the bravery of the men who had continued advancing despite the withering fire, who had helped wounded comrades, and who had ultimately succeeded in their mission despite catastrophic losses. These public appearances were difficult for Severloh, who remained a quiet and modest man uncomfortable with attention, but he felt it was important to bear witness to the reality of war and to honor the memory of those who had died. The story of Heinrich Severloh raises profound questions about war, responsibility, and memory. Was he a war criminal, a mass murderer who should be condemned for the deaths he caused? Or was he simply a soldier doing his duty, following orders in defense of his position as any soldier would? These questions don't have easy answers, and they point to the moral complexities that war creates. Severloh himself never claimed to be a victim or to be blameless. He acknowledged that he had killed hundreds, possibly thousands, of men and that this was a burden he would carry until his death. But he also maintained that he had been a soldier in a defensive position, firing at other soldiers who were attacking him, and that this was fundamentally different from the atrocities and war crimes committed by many others during the Second World War. From a purely military perspective, what Severloh did at Omaha Beach was exactly what he was trained and ordered to do. German doctrine emphasized the defense, and the positions along the Atlantic Wall were specifically designed to create situations where small numbers of defenders could inflict maximum casualties on attacking forces. The machine gun, positioned in a fortified bunker with clear fields of fire and adequate ammunition, was simply functioning as designed. Any German soldier in Severloh's position that day would have been expected to do exactly what he did. The true horror lies not in Severloh's individual actions but in the nature of modern warfare itself, which creates situations where ordinary young men can become instruments of mass death. The Battle of Omaha Beach succeeded despite the horrific casualties because the Allies had overwhelming numerical superiority, control of the air and sea, and soldiers willing to make incredible sacrifices to complete their mission. For every defender like Severloh in his bunker, there were dozens of American soldiers willing to advance into his fire. The sheer weight of numbers, combined with the courage and determination of individual soldiers and small units who found ways to infiltrate the German positions, eventually overwhelmed the defense. By the end of D-Day, Allied forces had established a foothold in Normandy that would never be dislodged. Within months, the German army in France would be destroyed, and the path to Berlin would be open. The sacrifice of those who died on Omaha Beach was not in vain, though that knowledge provides little comfort to their families or to soldiers like Severloh who lived with the memories of that terrible day. Heinrich Severloh died in 2006 at the age of 82, having spent the final decades of his life grappling with his wartime experiences and trying to promote understanding and reconciliation. His funeral in his small German village was attended by family, friends, and some of the American veterans he had befriended in his later years. The presence of these former enemies at his funeral was perhaps the most powerful symbol of the transformation that time can bring, and the human capacity for forgiveness. These men had once tried to kill each other on a beach in Normandy, but in the end, they recognized their shared humanity and their shared trauma from a war that had scarred them all. The legacy of the Beast of Omaha remains controversial and complex. Some see Severloh as a symbol of German military effectiveness and defensive skill. Others view him as a reminder of the terrible cost of war and the moral complexities that arise when ordinary people are placed in extraordinary situations. Perhaps the most important lesson from his story is that war creates situations where good people can do terrible things, not because they are evil or monstrous, but because they are following orders, defending their comrades, and doing what they believe is their duty. This doesn't absolve anyone of responsibility for their actions, but it does remind us that the true enemy is war itself, which transforms young men into killers and forces them to live with the consequences for the rest of their lives. Today, visitors to Normandy can still see the remains of Widerstandsnest 62, though the bunker is now silent and the fields of fire that were once so deadly are peaceful again. The beach below, where so many Americans died on June 6, 1944, is marked by memorials and monuments honoring their sacrifice. The story of what happened there, including the role played by Heinrich Severloh, remains a powerful reminder of both the heroism and the horror of war. For the families of those who died on Omaha Beach, the pain never completely fades. But the willingness of men like Severloh to acknowledge what happened, to express genuine remorse, and to reach out to former enemies in a spirit of reconciliation offers at least some measure of understanding and closure. The Beast of Omaha was never really a beast at all. just a young man caught in the machinery of war who spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of what he had done and to honor the memory of those he had killed.